Welcome. I'm John Henry, Chairman of the Committee for the Republic. We were all familiar with the story about the lady who asked Benjamin Franklin at the end of the 1787 Constitutional Convention, and I quote, "What have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" To which Franklin firmly responded, "A republic, if you can keep it." Now, what did Franklin mean? He didn't say we were a democracy. What did American citizens have to do to keep their new republic? He wisely said it was an open discussion, an open question. Each generation would have to do something to keep our young republic. What was that something? The Committee for the Republic exists to answer that question. To keep our republic, American citizens must vigilantly follow the Constitution. The Constitution, as you know, regulates our politics. And if we don't follow the Constitution, our politics will destroy the Constitution. The rule of law is the heart and soul of a constitutional republic. By contrast, a monarchy is essentially lawless. This individual is placed above the law. And it doesn't matter if a monarchy is inherited or elected. It's still lawless. For 22 years, the committee has shined a bright light on the clear and present danger of presidential wars. More than 170 impeachable offenses have gone unpunished for 180 years. Bruce, if you didn't attend Bruce's December salon, we detailed those, and that's available on YouTube. I recommend that you watch it. The Democratic and Republican parties have turned the Constitution upside down and created a presidency that resembles a monarchy that grows stronger with each transfer of power. How much longer can we deny that the destruction of separation of powers is the greatest crisis Americans have ever faced? Are we capable of facing this crisis? A constitutionally illiterate public is easy prey for empire builders who employ and exploit fear as their mechanism of control. To be sure, the world has always been and always will be a dangerous place. But the United States is the safest country in history. Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea do not present a threat to our Constitution. Make no mistake, our constitutional order is under attack by the very people we have entrusted to defend it. And no one has said it better than Lincoln. Lincoln said, "At what point is the approach of danger to be expected?" He answered, he said, "I answer, if it ever reaches us, it must spring up among us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide." Close quote. Tonight, we're examining the torrent of executive orders from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. In his first 31 days in office, Donald Trump has signed 66 executive orders. We will rank the most unconstitutional and place them in a historical context. Why do Democratic and Republican presidents govern with more executive orders than their predecessors? The bipartisan nature of this constitutional disease is what makes it so deadly. The last two presidents to sign more than 50 in the first 100 days were Harry Truman, 57, and FDR, 93. Joe Biden came close with 42. During the 2020 campaign, both Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders promised to use executive orders to carry out their agenda. Like Trump, Sanders had a desk full of executive orders ready to go on day one. Now, the Trump administration is bypassing the Attorney General and the legal review process at the Justice Department. In 2023, Trump's OMB chief now, Russ Vaughn, complained that Trump's policies in his first administration were thwarted. And listen to this quote, they were thwarted because, quote, the lawyers come in and say it's not legal. I don't want President Trump having to lose a moment of time, having fights in the Oval Office about whether something is legal. Close quote. When I read that, I fell out of the chair. No one is more qualified to analyze executive orders than my Vice Chairman, Bruce Fein. Bruce recently said, quote, President Trump will probably export the Constitution since he has no use for it at home. Close quote. You did say that, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
During the George W. Bush administration, he served on the American Bar Association Task Force on Presidential Signing Statements. For 40 years, Bruce has cast a write-in vote for James Madison or George Washington in every presidential election. I've only done it for 20 years, so I'm way behind Bruce. He has participated in and advocated the impeachments and convictions of Presidents Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Vice President Dick Cheney, and Presidents Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. How about that? Those are pretty good credentials, don't you think? Bruce has few equals in his unbending and unwavering defense of the Constitution. Bruce, it's all yours.
Thank you, John. This is right. Mark Twain said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it oftentimes rhymes. I make that observation because as you look out over the crowd and the political landscape, it reminds me very much of Watergate. Indeed, it perhaps does repeat. We're seeing it right now, Watergate. And part of the repetition is everyone who's in this audience. Because the claims that are being made from the Oval Office are echoes of what Richard Nixon claimed during the Watergate cover-up. Now, I was involved every day for 18 months, so I can speak with some credibility and granular detail about the events that led to the Saturday Night Massacre, Mr. Nixon's finally bowing to a court order to hand over the White House tapes and ultimately being impeached. At that time, when the Saturday Night Massacre and Mr. Richardson and Mr. Ruckelhaus resigned rather than fire Archibald Cox illegally, 30,000 telegrams poured into Congress every single day. And in 2 days, Mr. Nixon went from threatening to disobey a court order to hand over the White House tapes to saying, now I comply with the court. But it took 30,000 daily telegrams. Today I witness firings, most recently Southern District of New York, for protesting what was a de facto quid pro quo. If the mayor helps us on immigration, we're not going to prosecute him, even though all the evidence proves guilt. But I don't see 30,000 telegrams into the Congress today. That is ultimately what Archibald Cox said held the Constitution together, despite the attacks that Richard Nixon was making. And his arguments are foreshadowed exactly the claims that Mr. Trump is now making. Indeed, at least Mr. Nixon didn't quote Napoleon as an authoritative source at interpreting presidential power. But he did claim authority in national security to control the law. So the reason why I'm making these observations is that we need the same response today that the American public made in Watergate, 1973 and 1974. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And before we start the question and answer, a couple of other observations. One, I think I can say I'm the only person living who drafted an executive order in the Office of Legal Counsel that diminished executive power. We destroyed the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations that had a 30-year lifespan to drive people out of office because they belonged to some organization that the House Un-American Activities Committee said was a communist front. We eliminated, the first time an executive order struck at presidential power. The second thing I want to remind the audience is that our country and our liberties are not foreordained. If we think about the opening lines of Ralph Waldo Emerson's Concord hymn, and I like that because I was born near Concord. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flags to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world. The Minutemen knew they were fighting the British Army. It was the largest in the world at that time. But they were fighting and shooting shot around the world for liberty, self-government, the things that we enjoy today, because they took risks. We didn't win independence by spontaneous combustion. Paul Revere's Ride, the 18th of April in 75, all those things were come because people took risks. They became engaged. They knew the grievances we had against King George III and were willing to take risks, even their life, in order to secure our independence. And it is astonishing to me, with that recognition of how much we owe our ancestors, that there's such docility today. We at present aren't in the same danger as the Minutemen. But where's the outrage? I write into numerous members of Congress, say, you took an oath to support and defend the Constitution. It's on fire now. You're supposed to be the first responders when the Constitution is on fire. You're sitting and doing nothing.
We have this.
Yeah, right?
Picture's worth 1,000. Constitution burning. It's one thing to burn a flag. It's another to burn the Constitution.
Yeah.
Produces a little more emotional response, isn't it?
But Congress is going to do nothing unless we complain. There are many ways to complain. In person, writing, emails, whatever. But otherwise, I think we're on the verge of not showing the same kind of steadiness and courage that earmarked our success in Watergate and saving the Republic. And that's what I want to leave tonight when you go home. But now we can start.
Good.
So let me walk to sit there.
You want to take questions? You want to sit down and have it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll start. Okay, good. Come on, let's get these. Yeah, let's sit here. You're going to sit over there. So Bruce, just to kick things off here. So why don't we said in the invitation we would rank the Trump orders in terms of their unconstitutionality. Do you want to take a shot at that first?
Yeah, perhaps the one that's most brazen is an executive order that was issued on January 20th, declaring that persons born in the United States are not citizens if their parents were not legally present in the United States at the time of birth. notwithstanding the express language of the 14th Amendment, Section 1, that says, if you're born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, meaning that you have to comply with the laws, and no one has ever alleged that that these so-called birthright citizenship persons don't have to comply with the laws, then you're a U.S. citizen. In 1898, the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed what was pretty logical anyway. Someone was born to Chinese subjects. He left for China to visit his parents. He returned. They tried to exclude him, and the Supreme Court unanimously said, you're a citizen. You cannot exclude a citizen from the United States. So in terms of flagrantly ignoring the express language of the Constitution and the history and Supreme Court decisions, it's hard to imagine anything so anti-constitutional. And he issues it by an executive order. You could arguably make the case that because the Congress is entrusted with authority to enforce the 14th Amendment, maybe Congress could hold hearings and limit this kind of citizenship. But he didn't go to Congress. An executive order? By the way, an executive order has no constitutional standing. It's not mentioned in Article 2. It's just the president's made it up in order to justify usurpations. That's what I consider, and the reason why it's the most dangerous is because if you can make words mean the opposite of what they mean, then we're in Humpty Dumpty land. You know, the word means whatever I want it to mean, not more or less. Then the Constitution doesn't mean anything.
There's
And we could
zero
see
ambiguity.
Yeah, there's no ambiguity in Section 1, not at all. And if you take, apologize, and you can see this became epidemic with regard to manipulating language. The Constitution in two places entrusts the federal government with authority to protect states from military invasions. Okay? Mr. Trump, by executive order, says defenseless, unarmed men, women, and children across the borders are a military invasion and sends the military there. Really? Now, this is the first time anyone ever conceived of a war where one side doesn't have any arms. But I'm saying that once you give license to make words mean the opposite of what the ordinary language would cause you to believe, then he can make up anything. And I think we're coming to see that he is willing to make up anything and assert it. So, I mean, and then the most recent executive order that he issued today says that I am going to control all independent regulatory agencies. They're independent pursuant to a Supreme Court decision in 1935 called Humphrey's Executive. And the theory of his executive order is, I decide whether a Supreme Court decision is obsolete and should be overruled. I said, really? Now you have Article 3 power? He used to just say under Article 2 he had authority to do anything he wanted. Now he's usurping Article 3 authority as well. We can see where this is headed, in my judgment, is at some time, and it may be within months, I am sure Mr. Trump is going to declare, I'm not obeying this Supreme Court order. I don't have to. They're wrong. It's encroaching on my authority. And we will be back at the same crisis of Watergate. Again, then the American people stood up, 30,000 telegrams, Mr. Nixon backed down. If we don't have that response today, I don't think Mr. Trump is going to back down.
Okay, so that's number one. So that's number one, birthright. What?
Yeah, there's others.
Go to-
I think another claim that he has made, that he is not required to spend money that Congress has appropriated for particular purposes, where he stopped billions of dollars in expenditures. Now, the power of the purse is what James Madison said was the trump card, if you will, that Congress has over the executive, because the executive can't spend any money that Congress hasn't appropriated and must spend the money if Congress has appropriated it. Again, President Nixon tried to impound funds that had been appropriated to undertake environmental protection, and the Supreme Court unanimously said, no, you have to spend the money. Congress has not given you discretion on that score. And indeed, Congress has sought to deal with the possibility that appropriations at some point may become obsolete, unuseful, Congress said in the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, if the president believes that funds aren't needed anymore to achieve certain purposes, he goes back to Congress, says, I don't think these funds are needed. Congress has 45 days to enact a statute saying, we agree, we'll rescind this, and that's how you take care of that issue. Now, Russell Vought, the OMB director, among others, says, even though he's not a lawyer, the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional, we're not going to obey it. Elon Musk is not going to obey it. The courts initially now have stopped these usurpations of the spending power, if you will. Those cases are on appeal. They're likely to get to the United States Supreme Court. But the reason why even court decisions are less than completely satisfactory is, one, in the interim, all sorts of damage can be perpetrated. Oftentimes, the recipients of the funds are on shoelace budgets, and so they go out of business. You're trying to electrify a corpse, 3 years later with a court decision. You can't put them back, you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. The other reason is that in some instances, no one has standing. It's a technical legal concept that courts have used to keep certain disputes out of the judicial system, and says you have to use the political system unless you have an immediate concrete injury. And that means, despite the fact that not spending the money is a clear constitutional violation of the president's duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That's enshrined in Article 2, Section 3. Take care that the laws be faithfully executed. You're not discharging that obligation if you're not spending the money that Congress appropriated for a particular purpose. But if there's no standing to go into court, Congress has the remedy. It's called impeachment. But we know now we have a Congress that's an inkblot, but that's probably a disservice to inkblots. I think Congress is even less than an inkblot, right? It does virtually nothing. Right now, we had the chairman of the Appropriations Committee was on TV, I don't know, C-SPAN or something, a day or two ago, and said, well, we appropriate money, but it's just kind of there. The president can use it or not. He gave away the appropriations power. I mean, could you imagine I came here, Wilbur Mills, the head of the Ways and Means Committee, saying that? I mean, I would have gone apoplectic. So Congress is not, unless its makeup is changed in the next couple of years, going to resort to the impeachment power. And that means that we have a constitutional crisis, even if courts, in the cases where they have jurisdiction, block the president, because they're important cases. And you point out the war power, for example. Courts have never, ever opined on the war power. And we know Trump is continuing to fund all of the wars that he inherited from Biden. He may do others as well. I don't know. It's hard to imagine, because he's so unpredictable, what the next day's newspapers are going to read. But if somebody can say with a straight face that Ukraine attacked Russia in February of 2022, then he can say the moon's made of green cheese. So he's removed from reality. And that's a danger, because when he puts those fantasies into executive orders and has Elon Musk try to execute them, he completely destroys anything resembling the rule of law.
So what about TikTok?
Yeah, there's an example where TikTok, by the way, was
Raise it up.
social media that Congress decided it was going to ban, because it was worried that because the Chinese Communist Party has a controlling stake directly or indirectly in TikTok, it could use some of the information that TikTok users provide to TikTok to commit some kind of blackmail or otherwise gather sensitive information that would give the CCP, an edge in national security. Now, I spoke to some of my friends, former friends, the CIA, and I said, do you guys, did you ever try to, because the CIA and the NSA would gather this information far faster than TikTok. Would you go in 10 and 15-year-olds would try to gather information on the enemy, because maybe 50 years from now they may occupy? No, they just laughed at that. So I think the statute was ridiculous, but it was passed by Congress. The United States Supreme Court upheld its constitutionality. The statute itself provided for a 270-day waiting period, saying if TikTok could find a buyer that would be insulated from the Chinese government, they can get the proceeds of the sale. But if you can't get a buyer in 270 days, you got to shut down. So Trump comes in on the first day and issues an executive order. He doesn't go back to Congress and say, we need a little more time, because the 270 days expired on January 19th, the day before inauguration. So on Inauguration Day, Trump issues an executive order and says, I want 75 more days. He doesn't ask Congress for it. But he doesn't give a reason why it's 75 and not 750 or 7,500. He just picks it out of the sky. And he doesn't say after 75, that's a hard 75. He just says, I'm not going to enforce the law. But Article 2, Section 3 says your obligation is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, not sabotaged. And he uses an executive order, says, I'm going to sabotage the execution of the laws. He's still running around. He hasn't been able to find a buyer in any event. But there's a case, John, and the audience, where it's hard to find anybody to have standing. I wouldn't have standing. I've never used TikTok anyway. Probably nobody in this audience would have standing to say, I'm being injured because Mr. Trump is not forcing the shutdown of TikTok. But the principle is what is dangerous. It lies around like a loaded weapon. If he can decide, I don't want to enforce the TikTok statute, why not anything else? It doesn't have neon signs on it. There's no clue that this is one the president you can kind of squint at, you don't have to enforce. It means the president picks and chooses whatever laws that he wants to enforce. And TikTok is just an example. We know that recently Trump has issued executive orders saying, I really don't think the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act ought to be enforced anymore. It puts us at a handicap, so we really are not going to have any attorneys try to enforce the statute. Well, it was enacted in 1977. There are many prosecutions under it. The president doesn't get to, on his own, decide a statute is defunct. That's what the obligation to faithfully execute the laws are. But again, the only remedy here is impeachment. You're not discharging your duty. We don't have standing to sue and say you need to enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And he's done the same thing with the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Say, no, at least because I think he doesn't want to have AIPAC be required to register, as our good friend Jim Bamford knows, that they really are acting as echo chambers of Netanyahu and should be registering. So he just picks and chooses what statutes he doesn't like, says, well, forget it. That means that he is unilaterally, de facto, repealing the law. And as everybody knows, and Pat would too, if you want to repeal the law, you got to go to Congress and say, repeal the law. And sometimes you can have it. I remember during Reagan administration, there was a statute relating to health care that he thought was unwise, and it was very, very costly. So he went back to Congress and had the statute repealed. I mean, that's how separation of powers works. And really, if we think about the notion of what is really unique about the United States opposed to all other countries in the world, it's not the particular policies, although we celebrate free markets, it's that we understand that without separation of powers, there isn't any freedom anymore. We're just waiting for some tyrant to get there, and they're going to oppress our liberties, and then who succeeds them will oppress somebody else's liberties, just rotating dictatorial powers in the White House. And I think that's what we're seeing today. We can look at all the people that Trump has picked out that on his hit list. He may or may not try to throw them in jail, but he is able unilaterally strip them of security clearances for retaliation. He can strip them for security clearances for bona fide reasons, but he's clearly doing it just because he doesn't like their political views, which is very dangerous. My view, that probably violates the First Amendment, because you're punishing people because they're political associations, even if it's just a small punishment. But the principle lies around, and I can guarantee you it'll escalate if Trump feels that he has the support and the courts are blocking too many of his decisions.
So James Madison said that there are more instances of the abridgment of freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments of those powers than by violent and sudden usurpations. Now, that's another way of saying, or what we're seeing, is this a difference in degree or kind than Trump's predecessors?
Well, I don't think it's different in degree from what Richard Nixon was trying to do. That's what I tried to explain. He asserted all the things that Mr. Trump is asserting, maybe on a less of an industrial scale, but he was making the assertions anyway. So I'm not sure on that score there's nothing new here, but I do think that the theories that Mr. Trump is touting, that is different in kind. He said no other president would have ever considered quoting Napoleon as an authority on our Constitution, saying he's the one to be emulated. I mean, that's, I said, okay, who's next? Louis XIV, the state, I am the state. Yeah, pre-revolutionary France, that's the model of our Constitution. That's why we were fighting in 1776. So this is new, but I think what's very, very alarming is that I believe that no matter who succeeds Trump, they're not giving back any of this power. No president in the history of the United States has ever surrendered back power that he inherited from his predecessor. And I remember a meeting I had with John Conyers, used to be chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. He was head of the Black Caucus. And this was after Obama had won in November of 2008. He was going to come in and take over from Bush Cheney, who had all the abuses under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the War Powers, etc. And I had advised, said, listen, what you need to do is at least pass congressional resolutions disavowing, saying Congress does not accept the Bush-Cheney interpretation of Article 2. He said, Bruce, the consensus is Obama's going to give us all our power back. That's what he said. I said, this is not going to happen. And of course, it did happen. Obama took things, even the drone strikes, the ability to play prosecutor, judge, jury, execution, to kill anyone, to new levels, as Charlie Savage's book points out, although he had better language than Bush and Cheney had in describing what he was going to do. So the only way in which the successor to Trump is not going to continue to use those powers is tell him, we're impeaching and remove you if you accept inheriting such a lawless government. And they say that's because the framers understood that what makes separation of powers work is that it doesn't depend on personalities. It pits ambition against ambition. And the executive inherently is going to try to usurp power. What I think the framers didn't conceive is that the political parties would become so polarized, the loyalties are to the party over the Constitution, even though under the Constitution they only take an oath to support the Constitution itself, not the parties. And that's something that we're dealing with today. They'll only get over this party loyalty if we make it clear to them by communicating that's not acceptable. You can belong to a party, but the Constitution trumps party affiliation.
So, Bruce, if you had the choice between living in a republic where the Constitution was followed and you disagreed with all the policies that your fellow citizens voted for through their representative, you disagreed with all of them, would you choose that, or as versus where we are now, which is the two parties trade power, right? And when they have their person in the White House and they like the policies, they got to go silent on the Constitution, and then vice versa when they're out and the others are in, and the new ones, like the Republicans or Democrats, like the policies, they go silent. So they become constitutionalists, kind of the way Tommy Paine said, sunshine soldiers and summer patriots, or whatever.
Yeah, summer soldiers and sunshine patriots. Yeah. Well, I'd obviously subscribe and want to live in a system where process was followed. And you know, we've had sessions here, for example, on Trump versus United States. I think a horrible decision of the Supreme Court. I've never said we should just disobey it. Never. I've drafted constitutional amendment, encouraged it to be considered, despite the fact that I think the court got it wrong. You got to stick with the system, because there isn't any stopping point. Articulate a principle that says, well, you can disobey this decision, but not another one. And that's our only deliverance from arbitrary tyranny, which is what the framers understood. Another quote from James Madison is that it's right to take alarm at the first experiment with our liberties, because it's going to set a precedent. It's not going to stop there. And I say, and that's what we're sitting right here today. We are bound, in my judgment, we have to shoulder this responsibility. We see exactly what's going to happen. I mean, in some sense, it's easier with Trump because it's so transparent that he's completely lawless. It doesn't mean we defy the law itself, but we must exercise our right to seek redress of grievances.
What do you think the most unconstitutional executive orders have been in the past before Trump? How would you rank them?
I think, well, a couple. One, I believe Harry Truman's executive order that I undid with a loyalty program in 1947, clearly, in my judgment, violated freedom of speech that you don't forfeit when you become a federal employee. But perhaps the worst...
Explain that, unpack that a little for me.
Yeah. The U.S. Supreme Court has made clear that just because you are working for the government, you still have free speech rights, as long as those rights are not interfering with your ability to discharge your duties. And the loyalty review program was designed to crush that right. That you had a brother or a son, you attended a communist party or something, or you went to some subversive organization, and subversive meant whatever the Attorney General wanted to mean at the time, and they were really cowed by, at that time, Joseph McCarthy. And so they were destroying the right of all thousands, millions of employees of freedom of association. They cowed them into silence, so they wouldn't speak out. It suppressed, our political right to dissent, if you will. And that's what the loyalty review program, in one form or another, continued up till I drafted the executive order abolishing it in 1974, in June of 1974. That's how long it existed. And of course, it was that takeoff that caused, if you watch the movie Oppenheimer, Joe Oppenheimer was stripped of his security clearance based upon these stupid loyalty review programs. They lied, there were irregularities, and finally, I think under Biden, they reversed, 30 or 40 years later, the stripping of security clearance because there are procedural violations. But that was terrible. But perhaps the most monstrous one, and we celebrated the families of the Japanese Americans, 120,000 in World War II, by an executive order issued, not at the time of Pearl Harbor, just like 3 months later. 3 months later, after it was known that the Japanese Americans were not responsible for any espionage or sabotage, for 3 months. And despite the fact that we had a survey of the West Coast before the executive order, this was February of 1942, conclude that there is no proof that the Japanese Americans are disloyal, but they have racial strains with the Emperor Hirohito, and the fact that they've committed no wrong is confirming proof that treason is afoot. That's, okay? Take that out of Alice in Wonderland. Knowing this, and they lied to the U.S. Supreme Court when the case got there about how dangerous the Japanese Americans were, and because to the Occidental eye all Japs look alike, they couldn't trace individuals who they suspected, so they had to put them all in concentration camps. And then what became even worse is that when the military, before the end of the war in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, about a year before, the military told Franklin Roosevelt, we don't have any concern with Japanese Americans anymore. It was before November of 1944, which was the presidential race, and he was going to run a 4th time. So Roosevelt decided, no, I can't let them out because I could lose battleground states. This is Oregon, Washington, and California. If I leave them out, they're going to go back, and then they're going to create a backlash against me. So let's have them rot another 4 or 5 months. Then we can let them go after the presidential election. I mean, that is really quite contemptible. But, people forget that because we won the war, and they're the greatest generation, and all the other propaganda that comes out. There are certainly heroes, but it was not a very honorable thing. This isn't the way that the United States should be representing itself. Of course, another irony of the whole executive order, John, is that there were Japanese Americans who volunteered to fight for the United States, even though they were being persecuted. And they were the most bemedaled Air Force squadron flying over Italy per capita. They displayed that loyalty. We're still keeping them in concentration camps. That's really, really horrendous. Then there's another executive orders. These were Eisenhower. This is in 1949 when we established NATO. The military wanted Spain because it had proximity to the Soviet Union and had useful air bases and naval bases. But Franco, during World War II, at least was a semi-ally of Hitler. And he was very, very unpopular because of his reputation during the Spanish Civil War, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Anyway, he was in disrepute, so he couldn't get into NATO at the time. So Eisenhower says, well, I'll just do an executive agreement, executive order, creating a de facto alliance with Franco. So we had air bases there, we had naval bases there. He just totally circumvented, the treaty power by executive order, executive agreement. And again, the reason why, the principle is so worrisome, not because the immediate impact was so horrendous, but because it continues to aggrandize executive power, again, with no limiting principle. If you can do this, why do we even have a treaty clause? Just do things by executive order.
And then FDR took us off the gold standard with executive order, and Nixon slammed the gold window on the dollar, took that is the fiat currency off the gold standard abroad with executive order in August '71.
Yes, those things had perhaps more dramatic repercussions. They ended up, certainly the Roosevelt order was examined by the U.S. Supreme Court. They said, yeah, really it was illegal, but there's no remedy because Congress, the president can decide what the value of gold is. So they were worried that Roosevelt might disobey their order, so they crafted a decision that said he did it illegally, but there isn't any remedy, so he didn't have to pay a price.
They said it was illegal.
They said it was illegal, yeah. It took people's money because it basically said that if you had contracted prior to his executive order to have payments of obligations in gold, you couldn't collect anymore. The gold wasn't worth what you had bargained for. It's taking of property without due process, how we would characterize it today. And Nixon's taking off the gold standard too. I mean, that's the international gold standard, and he did it by executive order. I think he probably had more leeway given the fact that Congress had already given away some of its powers through delegation. It hadn't done that by the time Roosevelt, because it continued out those decades. The Congress did to give emergency power to the president. I think at that time, until the National Emergencies Act, presidents were operating with 60 or 70 emergency powers that Congress had never terminated. And this was one of them that the President Nixon relied upon. But I don't think they had the same doctrinal attack on the Constitution as a whole as these other decisions that the presidents have undertaken through executive orders, which I say logically means we have no Constitution other than what the president says it means. We're back to something very close resembling the Third Reich after Adolf Hitler became both Chancellor and President. They called him Der Führer, and the Enabling Act reduced the Reichstag to simply a claque for Adolf Hitler. And we certainly don't see Congress today doing anything. They're just kind of as spectators and watch Elon Musk do all the jobs that they're supposed to be doing, reviewing and overseeing executive branch to see whether they should be downsized or not. And they don't say anything other than stand and clap like inanimate objects. It's really quite disgusting, and the framers would have been completely appalled.
So, Bruce, let's open it up. Let's have a town hall here. Who do we have in the back here? Mr. Randolph.
Thanks. I think the animating purpose of the first clause of the 14th Amendment was to bring former slaves into the national community and give them citizenship. It was not intended to give or to entitle persons born to people who had entered our country illegally citizenship in our country. And I think I have to disagree with both of you that the language of that clause is unambiguous. The operative provision, the operative verb, the action verb in the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights, and in all the amendments, with few exceptions, is shall. It is an imperative, or it is a forward-looking verb tense. And if you look at the language of that first clause, it says all persons are citizens. So what the clause does is it brings all the former slaves, gives them all citizenship in that moment. And at that point, it's done its work. The drafters did not say shall be citizens. They did not say are and or shall be citizens. They said are citizens. And the language of almost all the other provisions in the Constitution and in the amendments uses shall. So there's I think you're not giving, I don't think it's unambiguous, as you said.
I think you're supposed to look at the purpose. It's like St. Paul, the letter killeth and the spirit giveth life. There is debate during the 14th Amendment that cast light on what they are attempting to accomplish. And it was more than just saying living slaves are now citizens. It's because it's hard to argue that would even emancipate the existing slaves, because at the time they were born, the 14th Amendment wasn't there. So there isn't anything to give them citizenship at the time, because you're only born after the amendment is ratified. But putting that aside, in the debate they had a discussion, because there are Chinese here that were not citizens. They were working on building the Intercontinental Railroad, and they said yes, they will be citizens, and that understanding was confirmed by the Supreme Court in 1898. It's an understanding that we have operated on for like 170 years, and you're suggesting that everybody got it wrong because it's simple. If you focus on the word shall, that's dispositive. Let's think about that kind of preoccupation with language as opposed to the purpose. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. It doesn't say anything about the judiciary or the president. Under your interpretation, well, Congress is not the president. It's not the judiciary. Judges can violate the First Amendment. The executive branch can violate the First Amendment. It's only Congress. But it's never been interpreted that way, because you have to ask, well, what is the purpose? And consistent with the purpose, then how do you advance in the overall goal? Go ahead.
Yeah, let him
Respond.
Go ahead, let him go.
Well, first of all, your comments at the outset were about the plain reading of the clause, and now you're moving on to purpose, and we can certainly talk about that.
Well, they're congruent in my
I'm
judgment.
offering a plain reading of the language, which I think John was offended by, that this administration is reading it differently. They aren't reading it in the way I'm suggesting, but I think there is a fair reading that advances the purpose of the initial of that amendment, and also is coherent with, I think, what most Americans want, which is not to have people who've entered illegally have be able to claim citizenship for their children. The reading that I'm suggesting would not preclude the people. It allows former slaves to be citizens in that moment. So I think your concern that it wouldn't have pulled everyone in is not it doesn't really meet the reading I'm suggesting.
Let me just make this observation. One, the executive order that President Trump issued doesn't make the argument that you make. The argument that the executive order makes is that they're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States if their parents are not citizens or permanent resident aliens. So it's odd that you're justifying the interpretation that even Mr. Trump doesn't embrace. In fact, I don't know if you go and read the arguments that the Trump administration is making in the courts, and I think there are 3 or 4 courts who have rejected your interpretation. They're not making your argument. So it's a little bit odd that what you find so plain is not available to anybody else, and certainly not to the United States Supreme Court. And when we say that the plain language speaks for itself, it's because it's consistent with the purpose, which is to say, if you're born in the United States and you have to obey U.S. laws, then you're a citizen. I don't think there's anything ambiguous about that whatsoever. But if you wanted to look at the history, and that there were Chinese who were born here to parents who were working on the Intercontinental Railroad, the Congress focused on that and said, yeah, they would be citizens too. It's an understanding that has prevailed for well over 2 centuries.
The reading I'm proffering would give them citizenship.
Let's go ahead, let David, yeah. Okay.
By good fortune, yesterday in the Washington Post, the Recropolis section by Petula Borjak, you may have seen it,
Speak into the phone.
went back to history
She got you.
to President Jefferson. And it'll take about 10, 15 seconds to read from the article yesterday in the Post. It notes that the Louisiana Purchase, of course, in 1803, that Jefferson said he understood why members of Congress ordered a fleet of defensive gunboats. But then when the Louisiana Purchase itself ended up as a peaceable kingdom, if you will, then the president, Thomas Jefferson, he knew something about the Constitution, but he apparently forgot at this moment. He then said, well, $50,000 had been appropriated to pay for these gunboats. And Jefferson said, pretty much, well, we don't need them. And so, as if I understand the history correctly, Bruce, this is possibly the first impoundment, if you will, and so it went through. Finally, in her article yesterday in the Post, she quotes Barbara Jordan long after Jefferson. Yes, I'm not going to imitate her stentorian and her Shakespearean cadence, but it's there in the article, and she basically says, Barbara Jordan, back in the period you were alluding to, namely Watergate, that Congress is just feckless and can't get it together to take action. Now, my question, here it is. Will it ever get better?
It gets better if we insist on it. Now, with regard to Jefferson, it's obvious that Congress has the authority to say, here's appropriated funds, and the president can use it or spend it as he wishes. That's not the situation that we're talking about right now. That we don't have a situation where Congress appropriates money and says it's conditional on the president's finding that this is useful or not. Now, whether or not, my suspicion is at the time that Jefferson said we don't need to spend this money, it's superfluous, there was that discretionary element that was built in to the statute itself, but I haven't looked at the statute in particular.
I'd like to bring you back to the point you made about the over 30,000, 300,000, whatever.
30,000 telegrams.
Telegrams at the time addressing the President Nixon's abuses. How could we even possibly see the same thing now? Because one, there was a different channel of communications. While we think we have more communications now, we actually have a lot less. I know from having worked in Congress, a lot of things don't get said to the members of Congress by their constituents. There's an assumption that something is going to happen. And that assumption, I see, has been magnified to where we are today, to the point that both sides of Congress don't really act on concerns that are brought forward, but even more so, there aren't concerns that are being brought forward. There's a lack of understanding nationally. One could attribute it to a lot of things. Primarily starts with education, and I'm talking about education as low as middle school and onward, about understanding what our country is and our government is and how it runs, and civics, which is no longer taught, by the way. So how are we going to get to the point where there's the public voice to make something happen, to make the people in Congress who are responsible to stand up and do their effing job? So,
Well, you can give the long answer. The short answer is that God sent Donald Trump to America to teach Democrats constitutional literacy.
Listen, There isn't any one magic bullet, but you can certainly email, you can write letters, be thoughtful. You can approach offices. If they're not here, they all have district offices, march in and say, listen, I'm going to vote against this gentleman unless he stands up and exercises his responsibilities under Article 1. We don't want anybody there who's an inkblot. This is what this person is doing right now. And collectively, that makes a difference. Every single member has district offices, if you can't come to Washington, D.C., and they do pay attention. I had two sons who were interns in offices, Senate and the House side. If it's written out and it's thoughtful, they really pay attention to that when it doesn't look like it came in on an automated postcard.
Yeah.
And they will get that. They will pay attention because very few people know how to write anymore.
Well, you're correct, but I have not heard that. I've spoken to a lot of people, just general American people that are not, in politics. And
If they get
just
30,000, if the members got 30,000 letters like that, don't worry, they would respond.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Marissa, that was great. I just have a general question, or a couple questions. First of all, what can the individual do? What are the range of things that the individual can do to deal with the situation? How can they reverse the situation? Secondly, we were talking about this a bit earlier. I think this would be useful for people to know that I thought that the best thing to do would be to go after those people from a legal point of view, from a criminal and civil point of view. You gave me sort of answers I think would be interesting for everybody to know. And then the third thing, I was wondering if shutting down Congress on March 14th would be one way of basically sending a message to Trump and his colleagues, or Musk, that this is unacceptable, that we need to take a very hard line. And I guess the third thing would be to have a general strike of one sort, like the 1930s. Anyway, I want to get your thoughts on those things.
Yeah, I think my understanding of the greatest contribution as an individual can make, you're young, run for office, and have your theme be the Constitution of the United States. You don't have to be a Republican or a Democrat, but you're going to restore separation of powers and the rule of law, however it comes out with regard to policy. We don't have anybody who runs on that campaign anymore, and it would be unique. But aside from that, there's difficulty with regard to criminal prosecutions because private citizens under the Constitution do not take care that the laws be faithfully executed on the criminal side. That's the president's obligation. He's not going to prosecute, doggy people or anybody else because he believes that they're doing the right thing, at least politically for him. There are civil suits that are available, but typically you have to find a defendant who has the power to redress the grievance that you had. And that person is usually somebody at the level of Musk or a cabinet secretary. It's not 19-year-olds running around looking at your private information, Social Security, or something of that sort. And indeed, there are perhaps 40 or 50 outstanding suits already been brought by private individuals or organizations. A good number of them have succeeded at the preliminary stages. And then the third, as I said before, you need to advocate. You need to talk to your friends, go in and urge your members that we're not going to vote for you unless you discharge your obligations. And collectively, it makes a whole lot of difference. But if you're silent and do nothing, we see exactly what's going to happen. I think about the burning of the Reichstag.
Do you think if the Supreme Court had not taken the president, put him above the law in the immunity decision, do you think Trump's behavior would have been different now?
Yes, I think that his lawyers are very aggressive and basically are operating under the assumption and telling him you can do whatever you want. You don't have to worry about anything, which is very alarming. And let me give you this hypothetical, which I hope remains a hypothetical, but there's a good chance it won't be. Under the Supreme Court's decision, Trump versus U.S., Trump could walk around to people in his inner circle and say, if you go assassinate my opponent, I'll pardon you. Don't worry about it. He had flirted with this idea and committing crimes on the southern border in his first term. He talked to an immigration official high up and said, don't worry, if you do this, if you go to jail, I'll pardon you. But it didn't happen. It remained more speculative. But that is the kind of power, an immunity, I suppose, that Mr. Trump enjoys. Because under Trump v. US, he can pardon people for any reason he wants. And it's beyond the power of any courts to redress. And so that's kind of frightening. You could figure he could pick out any group he disliked and tells his people, okay, you go ahead, you can go do whatever crimes you want against them. I'll pardon you. You won't have to worry about it. Really? Then we are really in dystopia.
So we were considering having another salon on executive agreements, which is looking out, as well as the executive orders, and then pardons, because pardons have now been so abused, and signing statements, which you have so much background on. So those are the three. All of these things, the executive orders, executive agreements, the signing statements, the pardons are all in the Episcopal Church what we call an outward and visible sign of an inward spiritual truth. In other words, it's an outward and visible sign of an imperial presidency. So let's pick up that, because who was it asked? Oh, you were asking, yeah. So, okay, so the way to do it is to, and I'd really love to have some reaction to this, because I've thought a lot about this, and because we've tried to work with Democrats and Republicans on the Hill, and basically, once they're up there, they have their own agendas, and so we've been considering running some candidates for the House in the next couple cycles. And so the way you would do it is you would go into the, 435 districts and 750,000 each, and you would pick some high schools in these districts where you wanted, and you find a candidate, and I don't care whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, whether they want more abortion or less abortion, more environment, less environment, more immigration, less immigration, more health care, less health care. Doesn't matter. Back them, and then in the high school, you go in and you teach constitutional literacy. And so the kids are gonna really be in a position, so when the candidates come to get elected, they're invited to the high school by the constitutional course members, and then they're gonna question the candidates. And then the candidate, was a Democrat or Republican, I don't care, they say, tonight I'm gonna take the pledge that I'm gonna put the Constitution ahead of my party. That regardless of how I feel about what my party, what we want on abortion or health care or immigration, social issues, I'm gonna put the rule of law ahead of the law of jungle. I'm gonna take a pledge tonight to you that if you elect me, I'm gonna do that. Now, will you, my opponent, take that pledge? So they've got two choices at that point. They've got to either say no, okay. So then, then you pull the burning Constitution out. You pull the Constitution out and burn it right from them and hand it to them. Or they say, oh, I'll take the pledge, and then you just strip them and show them to be constitutionally illiterate, okay? Now, I have two very good friends. One's very right of center. In fact, the other one is left of center. And they only agree on one thing, and one thing only. And that is, and these are people who live and breathe politics, right? Bruce and I don't live and breathe, we can't help. But we're not doing this politics for a living, right? And they say unequivocally that cannot happen. There's not one district out of 435 in this country where you could get a candidate in either party or an independent to go in and you could win on that issue. Okay? So I think that is wrong, but because I don't think the way I'm envisioning it that the Democrat wouldn't, or the Republican wouldn't, they wouldn't be disavowing the policies of their party. They would just say that if there's a conflict, they would put the party ahead. I'll be real. That I'll put the Constitution ahead of those policies. So it's just another arrow in the quiver, but it's the most important one. So anyway, that what do you have you got your hand up? Do you have a reaction?
Yes, I do. It's not in opposition to what you say,
Right.
but it's to state, essentially, everybody does that now. When they get elected, they take an oath to the Constitution of the United States. When you're hired at State Department, you take an oath.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So if you're taking the oath,
Yeah.
if you state you're gonna take the oath.
Right.
The point is, you know that you're gonna be taking the oath.
Let me answer that.
That's
So
I've gone to Spain and I have a good friend who's got me in these Catholic orders. And I'm, my dad was Episcopal minister. I'm not Catholic. We were Catholics for twice as long as we've been Protestants. But I go in and it's all in Spanish. And they go blah, blah, blah. And I go a little Spanish, poquito. But I have no idea what there's, and everybody in the room goes, see. And I want to march, right? So I say, see. Now, I don't know whether I'm agreeing to papal infallibility. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I know that if I don't say yes, I don't get in the club and I can't march. And that's what the congressmen, senators, they put their hand on the Bible, right? And swear to uphold a document that, okay, so there are only two possibilities when they do that, right? The Bible says they know not what they do. That's one possibility. They're constitutionally illiterate. They have no idea, like me, what they're agreeing to, right? But they know that they can't hold office unless they do that. Or the other is they know better, but they don't do the right thing.
Yeah, they keep their fingers crossed behind their back.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's go ahead.
To respond to they know not what they do, perhaps before you can run for Congress or the Senate or the presidency, you have to pass the same test that immigrants pass when they seek citizenship.
right.
Yeah,
What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Wait, I got to answer that. First of all, that's correct. I think the latest study showed that fewer than 1/3 of Americans could pass the citizenship test. But the U.S. Supreme Court has been quite clear that you cannot add to the constitutional standards for qualifications for the House, Senate, and presidency, which is just age, residency, and citizenship. So you can try to make it into a political campaign, but you cannot constitutionally add that as a requirement without amending the Constitution, which, of course, is something that I would encourage, because I do think that's important. One of the things I think to impose discipline on the idea you had, John, is to have a constitutional quiz that say the test of whether you're really truthful in making this pledge. Here's the test. What are your answers?
And we would design that. We had a constitutional literacy test several years ago. If any of you didn't take it and would like to take it, we'll give it to you. Well, let's go ahead and I'll come back because we have still answered your question.
Hi, thank you so much. I just want to say that the people who are in this room are fabulous, but what we really need are the young people. And we really need to do a TikTok video on the Constitution. Why it should matter to you. We could have the burning Constitution. That you gotta fight fire with fire, and we have a misinformation campaign going on. We have young people who are not engaged. I have a 25-year-old and a 30-year-old son, and they're like, well, what can we do? So the other thing is Jamie Raskin has actually done, I think, a pretty remarkable job in terms of being a charismatic member of Congress who talks a lot about the Constitution, a lot about the law. I'm really hopeful that he's going to be able to pull together some sort of a movement, because it's great as individuals that we do what we do, but we really need an organized movement to be able to pull everyone together, whether it be the ACLU or something that Jamie Raskin does. But we have to make the Constitution popular. What does it mean to you? Why should you care? Other than that, people are not going to get engaged because they're overwhelmed.
I don't disagree with your observation. I have tried with some success, but like Jimmy Carter's incomplete success on rescuing the hostages from Tehran, to have constitutional tutorials by Zoom, sometimes in person with congressional staff to say, listen, you don't have a clue what your powers are. And the turnout is really, really dismal. It's very, very difficult to get them engaged, including working with Jamie Raskin. So I keep trying, but out of literally thousands there, you get one or two, and then they don't ask questions, they don't return. I tell them, listen, you will call me at 3 o'clock in the morning, here's a phone number if you want to talk serious stuff. Nothing. You don't ever get those calls. So it's hard to awaken, enthusiasm. Going up next Monday to speak to Fordham law students in Columbia and NYU. I agree with you, young people, and we've spoken to that. We need young people in this group, but they have attention deficit disorder, and that's a real problem.
Go ahead, we have a hand back there in the back, and here.
Never had civics.
We'll get to you.
Social media today, including TikTok, the people who are the most engaged are the young people. And so the point is, they don't trust Jamie Raskin, because what the hell has the Democratic Party done to prevent this? They don't trust some of the institutions like ACLU. If you look on TikTok today, the best content, people who would be very interested and are showing incredible knowledge and care are the young people. And with all respect, this patronizing, condescending attitude like they don't care, I think it's the opposite. They do care. And they feel that we did something wrong that it got this bad.
Exactly, I agree with that.
Show up for the young people here.
I agree with that 100%. And so in this, where we've had the Committee for Republic Constitutional Literacy test, we've educated the high school, the 2 candidates are in, and then the pledge is made. At that point, the candidate squares off against the opponent and says, okay, I have the best political minds in this country tell me that I can't win if I do this. Now, I think that we are better than that. And what I want to do is lead the country with you. I want you to lead the country. And so I would tell the story about, I had this, when I took up golf at 40, I went and found the guy that won the Nationals in 1971. He was at the University of Houston. And he only won once on the tour, but when he went out for the senior tour, he shot the lights out on the senior tour. And I said to Tom, I said, how many people went out for the senior tour? He said 10,000. I said, how many places were there? He said, 10. I said, well, I wasn't a math major, but those are terrible odds. He said, John, you don't understand. I don't need 10 places. I only need 1. So we only need 1 district out of 435 where we find a candidate. And they go in and they force that issue. And they say, I think we're better than this district can lead the country. Because this will go electric. If we win this election, you win the election, this district goes on the record that we're going to put the Constitution ahead of the party, right? And then if they win, then I think it could be electric. But maybe that's the only way I see this out of this.
I don't place as much emphasis on winning. The fact that you run is the educational process is even more important. 1776 didn't happen by spontaneous combustion. The framers were thinking about this, protesting as far back as the Stamp Act 1765. It takes a while to educate people to understand it. The first time out is probably not going to be able to be absorbed. You point out there's no civics education anymore. It's just off the curriculum. So the critical thing is that you're at least making it a subject of discussion. So people think, oh, I guess there is a constitution. We see what the consequences are. But it's just the nature of change that the first time out, I think it's not going to win. But it doesn't mean it won't win the third time out, as long as you continue down that road.
Well, tell them where we would, one idea of where we would find a candidate.
Yeah, I think that there's pre-selection of individuals who would be very promising as candidates. The clerks of, just in the District of Columbia, the District Court, the Court of Appeals, and the U.S. Supreme Court. If you take all the clerks together, and they've been pre-screened, so they know how to write, they know how to speak, they're very gifted in the law school performance, they're probably talking over 100 clerks together. The Court of Appeals judges have 3 clerks, Supreme Court 4, district judges have 2, and you could interview them. They don't have $1 million mortgages at the time. They're not making $500,000 a year the first time out in a law firm, and they might be stimulated by this kind of challenge that is more productive in their minds than joining a big law firm.
All right, we're going to get there.
If I could make a comment, we may be jumping into this too early. If the courts issue orders and the president and the administration don't obey the orders, then we really got a huge problem. But I don't think we're there yet. Now, let me just take the citizenship thing where the gentleman was asking questions. The way I understand that, there are people who think that the 14th Amendment, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, does not apply that a person who is an illegal immigrant, the third child, is an American citizen. Now, that's a legitimate.
No, but are you saying, Pat, that they're not subject to the jurisdiction?
So, you cite the case, I think, of 1894 with the Chinese fellow. He was born in America. His parents were legal immigrants when he was born in America. And he went back to China, and he was denied entry into the United States as illegal. And he sued, and he won that case that he was born in America, legal immigrants, so he was an American citizen. We've never had the courts rule on the illegal immigrant. So the president issued an executive order. Now, why would he do that? Because he wants to see what the courts will say. Maybe the Supreme Court will rule in his favor. If not, maybe then they'll do a constitutional amendment. But I don't think we want to jump all over things until they get to the crisis. I don't think we're at the crisis stage yet. I think we would be. And my understanding is district courts have put a hold on that executive order as having any effect. More than one district court, and so it's going up to the courts. Well, let's see what the courts say before we start down the road to saying that that's a terrible thing. And it would be if the Supreme Court rules against the Trump, and then he tries to implement it, well, then that would be a different case. But we're not there yet, I don't think. And I think that we lose credibility by going after these issues before they're ripe.
First of all, the language of the 14th Amendment uses the term born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof.
Correct.
So do you think that there's an argument to be made that if you're born in the United States, but your parents are not here authorized, you're not subject to the jurisdiction?
Illegally.
Yeah, and they're illegally, say they're there criminally, that you're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States and you can commit whatever?
The courts will decide that now.
Okay, well, all I'm saying is that at least at present, every court has said you are subject to the jurisdiction. And one court, yes, every one of them has said that so far. It's true, but the district courts are ruling it on right now. In fact, the judge, of course, if you waited till every decision got to the Supreme Court before you decided the issue, we'd have a lawless situation because it takes a long time. They take about 50 cases, and you could be flouting 50 or 60,000 laws. And the judge out in Washington said, I don't understand how a lawyer could have even signed this executive order. It was so contrary to the understanding and the purpose and the legislative history of the act. But I want to go to the other point that you made, is that until you get a defiance of a court order, we're not at a crisis. That's not true, because there are many violations that cannot and will not be decided by Article III courts because of standing, mootness, political question, and those sorts of things. Like, for example, the decision not to comply with the law against TikTok. So that means that unless Congress impeaches, the president can flout the obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, and if he doesn't like them, he needs to get them changed.
There's not been a suit brought against TikTok on his interpretation of TikTok, has there? No.
There's no one has standing. Go ahead.
Hello. In the early 1900s, also during World War I and World War II, there was a community of business leaders who went to work for the federal government, and they were known as dollar-a-day men. And the idea was that they had to take a salary in order to execute their duties. Trump did not take a salary. In his first term, he's not taken it yet. Could an argument be made that he is not legitimate because he's not taking a salary?
I think he's donating his salary. It's not like he's turning it aside. So that means that he's complying with the obligation.
President Kennedy did that. He did not take the salary, he donated it.
I did not realize that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, so in the ranking of most egregious stretches of presidential power to the least egregious, you gave some examples of the kind of most offensive ones. Could you give us a couple of examples of the ones on the bottom of the list with a follow-up question of, is there a role still in your mind for executive orders or ones that you are comfortable with?
You understand that?
I think it is. The most terrifying assertion of executive power isn't in an executive order. It's just, and we can understand presidents can do things defying court orders that wouldn't be an executive order, just say I'm not complying with the law. That's why I think in some sense being preoccupied with the title of executive order can be misleading. But what is most terrifying, and what we've lived with at least since 9/11, is presidential assertions of power, as I've stated so many times, to play prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner to kill anybody he wants without any accountability. We don't know how often it happens. We know at least from some leaks that the teenage son of Anwar al-Awlaki was exterminated in Yemen. He was a U.S. citizen. He hadn't been accused of any crime, but he was wiped off. Most people probably doesn't even know he's existed. But we don't know how many such things happen. If we want to extrapolate from the Church Committee's revelations of the decades-long violations, assassination attempts, most of them fortunately did not succeed, we can probably assume that there are far more than have leaked out to the press, from the press to us. But that is truly shocking. A president of the United States can have an assassination squad like he's the Godfather and no accountability. Now, with regard to some of the executive orders, I consider largely harmless. Okay, at least within U.S. jurisdiction, 200 miles off the coast. Now we have a Gulf of America rather than a Gulf of Mexico. And now we don't have Mount Denali, we have Mount McKinley to celebrate somebody who initiated waterboarding in the Philippines and stretched the war power past its constitutional constraints. But I think that in some sense, it's misleading to just focus on executive orders. I consider, for example, his firing of the U.S. attorneys in New York because they wanted to honor what they had done, their handiwork, and it wasn't questioned that they had gone through all the proper procedures. The evidence of guilt by Eric Adams satisfied their standard of believing they could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, and they decided openly, well, but he's a political figure, he'll maybe help us on immigration, so the heck with the law. And you could imagine what that does to the ability to enforce the laws. It means everybody comes in and says, yeah, I may be guilty, but I'll help you out politically, and therefore you're going to drop my case. And that's basically the theory behind the dismissal there. You have the Department of Justice here in Washington had to sign the motion, which hasn't been granted yet, to dismiss the case without prejudice to Eric Adams. But I find that really horrendous. It's very similar to Nixon's firing, insisting that Cox be fired through Ruckelshaus or Richardson. And then the American people pushed back, and he backed away. He appointed a successor, Leon Jaworski, so the investigation continued. But I doubt that's going to happen with regard to Eric Adams, certainly right now.
Bruce, we've run out of time. Bruce will be here to answer any questions, but
Yeah.
we really appreciate you doing this, and we're going to have a number of these salons on the various, so we just picked executive orders because that's so much in the papers now, but we'll be doing other salons on other aspects of the abuse of power.
Yeah, just the last comment. Listen, the people who deserve applause are you here. The highest office in the land, I say, is U.S. citizen, because ultimate sovereignty resides in you. You're the ones who deserve the applause, showing up, showing that you're interested here. And that's what I would commend everyone who's present, engaged, and interested in saving the country, the same spirit of the Minutemen in 1775.
Thank you, Bruce.